Welcome to this episode of Preaching the Word, a video series on preaching sponsored by the Dunk Tank and the Berman Ministry Center. My name is Dr. Stephen Reasor, and I'm a preacher and author, and I teach preaching at Berman University in Lacombe, Alberta. In this episode, we're going to learn how to shape the major parts, or moves, in the sermon. This is the 8th step in our 12-part sermonic process. In this step, we need to create 2 short lists, a list of tasks and a list of moves. The first list, the list of tasks, states those things the sermon needs to complete in order for it to fulfill its function. So remember, the function is what the sermon will do. It's the sermon's big purpose. This list of tasks should be between 5 and 8 items long. The exercise helps us to think more deeply about both the claim of the text and the situation of the congregation. So what needs to happen during the sermon in order to get the congregation from where they are to where we hope they will be by the end of the sermon? What perspectives do they need to consider? What objections do you need to raise and answer? What ideas do they need to challenge in order to experience a change? In my sermon from Luke 17, I've identified the thing I want the sermon to do. Its function is, as we recognize that we all make mistakes, the sermon will turn the eyes of the congregation away from imperfect leaders and our imperfect selves, and will reignite a desire to serve and obey Jesus as the sole object of our faith. So, as I start my list of tasks, the first task I will state will be to invite the congregation to look past others and focus their faith on Jesus and serve and obey Him. But what will I have to do so that this is possible? The next task is that I will need to clarify faith's relationship with some things like grace and obedience and faithfulness. These are the elements at work in our pericope, and I will need to explore those relationships so that the church can have a new perspective on faith. But the church members already have many ideas about faith. Some of them may be a less than full picture of faith. So another task would be to identify inadequate claims about faith. Now we have a couple more tasks that need to be done early in the sermon, but before we talk about those, we need to pause and discuss the overall shape of the sermon. Now, there are many forms that sermons take. Some sermons follow a point-by-point outline that centers around a main theme, much like you would write for a college essay. Other sermons follow the flow of the biblical text that is being preached from one verse to another. Other sermons are arranged by major topics or perspectives. In a later video in this series, we will explore a wide range of types of sermon forms. But for this part of the series, we're going to use a very specific form of sermon developed by Eugene Lowry. I had mentioned earlier that you should purchase his book, The Homiletical Plot. This small book presents a series of moves that follow a specific sequence. It is a narrative or plot-based series of moves that follows the very natural ways that we talk to each other all the time. We'll discuss this in more detail in a minute. So if you have his book, I recommend you read it right away. Lowry's first sermon move is to upset the equilibrium of the congregation. In other words, the first move needs to introduce some manner of ambiguity, some problem, some question that truly reflects the state of the church or the world in relation to the preaching text. This is why we look for things that unsettle us or that we find difficult in the text as we study it. The reality of living in a sinful world is that our world is consistently at odds with the kingdom of heaven. This conflict results in a host of uncertainty and difficulty as we follow Jesus, and it is the preacher's duty to discuss these problems. So my list of tasks needs to include this recognition of the problem that the sermon will address. And there are 2 parts to this task. The first move of my sermon needs to create a context or perspective that helps the congregation view faith from the master's perspective. And the second part is it needs to demonstrate our collective failure in regards to faith. So together, these create a compelling case that we, the community of faith, lack faith to a significant degree. This is the problem. It's the ambiguity. and we will work to resolve it. Now, I have a complete list of tasks that my sermon needs to enact in order for it to function properly. Now we need to make another list. This second list states the major parts of the sermon, or as David Buttrick calls them, the moves of the sermon. In his book, Homiletic, Buttrick says, "Language is inescapably linear. While we may experience life as wholeness, with all sorts of sensations happening at the same time, when we tell our experience, we do so in a series of sentences strung together one after another." In the same way, Buttrick notes, sermons are a movement of language from one idea to another, and each idea is being shaped in a bundle of words. Each of these bundles is called a move. A typical sermon will have 4 or 5 or 6 moves, with each move taking between 4 and 7 minutes to be formed and come to life in the imagination of the congregation. It is during this step of the sermon process that we decide what each move will be. As I noted a few minutes ago, for this part of this video series, we're going to shape our sermons along the lines of Lowry's homiletical plot. This means we already have a plan for what each move will be, and there will be 5 moves. The first move will upset the equilibrium of the congregation in some way. It will introduce a problem or conflict or some type of ambiguity. The second move will analyze the discrepancy. It will explore the depths of the problem, will allow the conflict to deepen and the tension and anxiety related to the problem to increase. This move invites contrary voices and problematic ideas into the sermon so that they can be addressed and rebutted. The third move introduces the clue to resolution. It's the point in the sermon that we shift our perspective regarding the problem so that we see it from a new angle, a perspective that resolves the conflict, while at the same time opening up a new vista of the gospel. The fourth move invites the congregation to experience the gospel anew from this new viewpoint. It demonstrates how the Bible's solution to our dilemma is good news. And the fifth and final move anticipates the consequences of this fresh experience of the gospel. In this move, the preacher and the congregation imagine together what could and should be different about their lives from this day forward. Taking into account the claim of the text, the focus and function of the sermon, and the various tasks outlined in the task list, the moves of my sermon are: Move 1, although bosses want watchful, guarded employees they can trust, we often prove untrustworthy. Move 2, whether we work hard or don't try at all, we are not good employees. We are faithless. Move 3, faith is not passive. It means to trust and honor and obey. Move 4, such an act of faith is only possible, though, because of grace. And move 5, we can serve God and demonstrate His grace with our obedient faith today. It is important at this step that these move statements clearly state the claim of each move and that they flow logically from one to the next when read together. Let's check my move statements for logical coherence. Although bosses want watchful, guarded employees they can trust, we often prove untrustworthy. Whether we work hard and we don't try at all, we are not good employees. We are faithless. Faith is not passive. It means to trust and honor and obey. Such an active faith is only possible because of grace. We can serve God and demonstrate His grace with our obedient faith today. Now, I have developed a series of moves that will allow my sermon to achieve the tasks I have set for it, to say and do for the congregation what Jesus' teaching in Luke 17 said and did for His audience. Your assignment is to make a list of tasks necessary for your sermon to function properly, and then to develop the list of moves, what the sermon will say and in what order it will say it. Remember, we're also learning Lowry's homiletical plot, so your moves should follow his series of moves, which means you need to read his book. And I would suggest that you read Tom Long's book as well as you're working on this step. This concludes this step. When you've finished your assignment, join me for the next episode of Preaching the Word, where we will look at each individual move and begin to let it come to life.